There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend leaning against you on a worn-out sofa. You don't recognize them as watersheds at the time. They are simply minutes, passing like any other. It's only later, when you trace the map of your own heart, that you find the single, unassuming point where the river of your life changed its course forever. You see the before and the after, and you realize you were standing on the fault line without ever feeling the tremor. For me, that moment smelled like rain-damp wool and coffee gone cold. It felt like the impossibly warm, solid weight of Finn's head resting on my shoulder, his breathing a slow, steady tide against the shell of my ear. It was a moment of profound stillness that contained the most violent kind of hope, a hope so terrifying it felt like its own kind of breaking. He had fallen asleep perhaps an hour ago, surrendering to exhaustion in the middle of a sentence. One moment he was murmuring about lines of code that refused to compile, his voice a low, frayed thing in the dim light of the living room, and the next he was silent. The surrender was total. His body, which was so often a vessel of restless energy, a tightly coiled spring of athletic grace and nervous tension, had finally gone limp, trusting me with its full, unguarded weight. His dark hair, still damp from the autumn drizzle he'd walked through to get to my apartment, was soft against my neck, and I could feel the slow, even pulse in his throat just inches from my own. I sat perfectly still, a statue carved from fear and reverence, my entire world narrowed to this single point of contact. My own breathing was a shallow, cautious thing, a prisoner in my chest. I was terrified that any movement, any sigh, any shift in my posture would wake him, and the spell would be broken. This quiet, fragile intimacy was a borrowed thing, a fluke of exhaustion and friendship, and I knew, with the aching certainty of someone who has spent years cataloging every scrap of affection, that it was not truly mine to keep. Finn was a cartographer of boundaries, even if he was unaware of his own science. Our friendship was a territory with clearly marked borders, established over years of unspoken treaties. There was the easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the late-night conversations about everything and nothing. There was the steadfast loyalty, the implicit promise that we were a safe harbor for one another. But there was also a line, a delicate, invisible filament that separated friend from more. I had lived on my side of that line for so long that its location was etched into the very fiber of my being. I knew its every twist and turn. I knew the exact proximity that was acceptable, the precise duration a casual touch could last before it began to mean something else. I was the diligent guardian of that border, because I knew that I was the one with everything to lose. And now, here he was, sleeping on my shoulder, having crossed so far into my territory that he had pitched a tent in its very heartland. He had done it without asking, without intention, guided only by the magnetic pull of fatigue. And I, the loyal sentry, had simply let it happen, my own heart a traitorous accomplice in this beautiful, devastating invasion. The television droned on, casting flickering blue light across his face. The movie we'd put on, some forgotten black-and-white classic, was now just ambient noise, a soundtrack to my own silent, frantic monologue. I studied the way the light caught the curve of his eyelashes, long and dark against his skin. I saw the faint tension that remained in his brow even in sleep, the ghost of the stress that had driven him here tonight. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap and the earthy perfume of the city rain still clinging to his sweater. Every sensory detail was a photograph I was taking with my mind, developing it in the darkroom of my memory, fixing it with a chemical wash of pure, unadulterated yearning. I knew this was a moment I would return to again and again. It would become a memory I'd handle with immense care, like a fragile glass negative, terrified of smudging it with the fingerprints of my own impossible longing. This was the paradox of loving him. The moments of greatest closeness were also the moments of most profound loneliness, because they highlighted the vast, silent chasm between what we were and what I so desperately wished we could be. He was here, closer than he had ever been. And yet he was a universe away, lost in a dream where I was likely nothing more than a comfortable place to rest his head. I met Finn on a cold, windswept afternoon in my first year of college. I was a ghost haunting the edges of campus life, more comfortable viewing the world through the rectangular frame of my camera's viewfinder than participating in it directly. My camera was both a shield and a window. It allowed me to observe, to be present, without the terrifying obligation of being seen. That day, I was on the sidelines of the soccer field, trying to capture the raw, kinetic energy of the game, the spray of mud from cleats, the grim determination on a player's face, the fleeting geometry of bodies in motion. He was the center of that motion, the gravitational pull around which the entire game seemed to orbit. Finn was all fluid power and startling speed, his focus so intense it was a palpable force. He was the kind of person who seemed to burn brighter than everyone else, who drew all the light and attention in a room, or in this case, on a field, without even trying. He was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, unself-conscious, powerful, and utterly captivating. I was so lost in my work, in the rhythm of click, focus, click, that I didn't notice the game had ended until he was standing right in front of me. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed, a streak of mud high on one cheekbone. I remember my first thought was an artist's thought. The contrast of the dark mud against his pale skin was perfect. My second thought was pure, unadulterated panic. He was talking to me, the quiet observer, the boy on the sidelines. I had spent a semester documenting the world he inhabited, but I had never imagined he even knew I existed. He asked what I was shooting, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone who had just spent 90 minutes in a state of controlled aggression. I mumbled something about a project for my photography class, about capturing movement. He nodded, a genuine curiosity in his eyes that disarmed me completely. He didn't look at me with the pity or dismissal I was used to from people like him, the effortlessly popular, the socially adept. He looked at me like I was a person with something interesting to say. That first conversation was clumsy, at least on my part. I was a collection of stammers and averted gazes, overwhelmed by his directness, by the sheer force of his presence. But he was patient. He asked to see the photos on my camera's small screen, and he didn't just glance at them. He studied them. He pointed to one, a shot of him in midair, his body a perfect arc as he went for a header. He commented on the light, on the way I'd framed the shot to isolate him against the gray sky. He saw what I was trying to do. He saw the intention behind the image. No one had ever done that before. People saw my photos as simple records of an event, but he saw the art in it. He saw me in it. That was the beginning. It was a small, quiet moment, but it was the first stone laid in the foundation of everything that would follow. We discovered a shared, improbable love for old French New Wave films, a mutual obsession that made no sense given our respective places in the campus ecosystem. He was the star athlete, and I was the art kid who spent his weekends in dusty darkrooms. But in the flickering black and white of a Goddard film, we found a common language. Our friendship grew in the quiet spaces between our two very different worlds. It flourished in late-night study sessions in the library, in shared headphones listening to a band no one else we knew had heard of, in long walks across a sleeping campus where the only sounds were our footsteps and our voices. I became the keeper of his anxieties, the one he came to when the pressure of his scholarship and his team's expectations became too much. He, in turn, became my champion, the one who dragged me out of my shell, who insisted my photography was more than just a hobby, who saw a strength in my quietness that I had always mistaken for a weakness. He was the only person who seemed to understand that my silence wasn't empty. It was just full of thoughts I didn't know how to say. And somewhere in the midst of all that, I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic fall. It was a slow, imperceptible slide, like a coastline eroding over centuries. It was so gradual that I didn't even realize it was happening until I was already submerged, the water closing over my head. His girlfriend at the time, Sarah, was nice enough. She was bright and bubbly and moved through the world with the same easy confidence that Finn did. They looked right together, like a photograph from a catalog, a perfect matching set. I liked her truly, but I was also jealous of her in a way that felt like swallowing powdered glass. I was jealous of the way he would casually sling an arm around her shoulders, of the way he looked at her across a crowded room, of the simple, unthinking intimacy they shared. I watched them from my carefully constructed observation post on the other side of the boundary line, and I learned my love for him was a thing that had to live in the dark. It was a secret I kept locked in the most fortified room of my heart, a room with no windows and only one key, which I kept swallowed. To risk that secret was to risk the friendship, and the friendship was the most vital, life-sustaining thing I had. It was the architecture of my entire college experience. So I became an expert in the art of platonic affection, mastering the brotherly pat on the back, the carefully measured hug. I learned to speak a language of friendship so fluently that I hoped even my own heart would be fooled. After college, our lives diverged and then converged again. I found a niche for myself as a freelance photographer, capturing the quiet soul of the city's architecture. Finn was recruited by a fast-rising tech startup, a world of frantic energy, impossible deadlines, and immense pressure. He and Sarah had moved in together, then drifted apart in that slow, painful way that happens when two people realize they are growing in opposite directions. Their breakup was an amputation, messy and agonizing. And through it all, I was his constant, the fixed point in his chaotic orbit. Our friendship, forged in the relative simplicity of campus life, proved strong enough to withstand the complexities of the adult world. My small, quiet apartment became his sanctuary, a place where he didn't have to be the brilliant coder or the rising star. He could just be Finn, exhausted and uncertain. The change was subtle at first, a slow increase in the frequency of his late-night visits, the kind of shift in atmospheric pressure that precedes a storm. The real shift began on a Tuesday. I remember the day specifically because Tuesdays are usually my quietest day, a day for editing and solitude. But that evening, my buzzer rang, and Finn's voice, strained and thin through the intercom, asked if he could come up. When I opened the door, he looked like a man who had been weathered by a private, internal hurricane. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight, and he was holding a crumpled document in his hand, a project proposal, I think, that he had been staring at for so long the words had likely lost all meaning. He didn't offer a real explanation, just a mumbled apology about needing to get out of his own head, his own apartment, which he said felt like a pressure cooker. I didn't ask for more. I simply stepped aside and let him in, the way you open a door for someone caught in the rain. He collapsed onto my sofa as if his strings had been cut, letting the crumpled papers fall to the floor. He didn't want to talk about work, or Sarah, or anything at all. He just wanted silence. So we sat in a comfortable, familiar quiet, the kind only old friends can share. I made coffee, which he held in his hands for warmth, but didn't drink. I put on an old movie, one of our favorites, something with familiar rhythms and no emotional demands. I watched him from the corner of my eye as the film played. I watched the tension slowly seep out of his jaw, the rigid line of his shoulders soften. He was a ship lowering its anchor in a calm bay. And then, about halfway through the film, his head began to nod. His blinks grew longer, slower. Finally, with a soft, almost inaudible sigh, his head listed to the side and came to rest against the back of the couch, his eyes closed. He had simply powered down. He slept for 2 hours. I didn't move a muscle. I just sat there, in the chair across from the sofa, nursing my own cooling mug of coffee, and watched him breathe. The city lights painted soft patterns on the walls of my apartment, and the only sound was the movie's score and the slow, rhythmic cadence of his sleep. It felt sacred, in a way. He had chosen my quiet, my space, as the place he could finally let go. He had sought out my silence as a balm for his own internal noise. When he finally woke, it was with a start, a disoriented blink against the dim light. He looked at me, a flicker of embarrassment in his eyes. "Sorry," he mumbled, rubbing his face. "I didn't mean to." I just shook my head. "It's fine," I said, and the words felt ridiculously inadequate. "You looked like you needed it." He gave me a small, grateful smile that I felt somewhere deep in my sternum. That night, a new precedent was set. My apartment was no longer just a place to visit. It had become a refuge. The unspoken rules of our friendship had begun to soften, their ink bleeding at the edges. That night became the blueprint for a new ritual. A few times a week, often late, Finn would appear at my door, looking like a soldier returning from a war I couldn't see. He brought the ghosts of his day with him, the frantic energy of his office, the weight of his responsibilities, and he would shed them, one by one, in the quiet sanctuary of my living room. We would fall into the easy pattern of putting on a movie, of sitting in a comfortable silence that felt more restorative than any conversation. And more often than not, he would fall asleep. The sofa became his domain. At first, he would wake up after an hour or two, apologize sheepishly, and drag his exhausted body back to his own empty apartment. I would watch him go, my heart a complicated knot of relief and disappointment. I was glad to be his safe harbor, but every time he left, the silence he left behind felt heavier, more pronounced, than it had before he arrived. The first time he stayed the night, it was almost an accident. A storm had broken over the city, a violent deluge of rain and wind that rattled the window panes. He had fallen asleep on the sofa, as had become the norm, but this time he slept deeply, a sleep so profound that it seemed nothing could wake him. The movie ended, the credits rolled, and the screen went black, plunging the room into near darkness. I watched him for a long time, his face peaceful in the ambient glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. It felt wrong to wake him, to send him out into that storm when he was so clearly depleted. So I didn't. I pulled the Afghan from the back of my armchair and draped it over him gently, my movements slow and deliberate. I made sure it was tucked around his shoulders. Then I went to my own room, leaving the door ajar, just a crack, as if to keep the silence in his room from feeling too absolute, too lonely. I lay in my own bed, awake for hours, listening to the sound of the rain and the impossibly comforting sound of his soft, even breathing from the other room. This became the next stage of the ritual. The pretense of him going home began to fade. Sometimes he would ask, his voice low and hesitant, "Do you mind if I just crash here?" Most of the time, it was an unspoken assumption. He'd arrive, we'd watch a film, he'd fall asleep, and I would cover him with the blanket and retreat to my room, leaving the door slightly open. That sliver of light from the hallway, the thin channel of sound connecting our two separate spaces, became a symbol for me. It was a connection, a concession to a closeness that we couldn't acknowledge in the full light of day. I would lie in my bed and catalog the sounds of him sleeping, a soft sigh, the rustle of the blanket as he shifted, a mumbled word from a dream. These were tiny, insignificant things, but to me, they were a secret language. They were proof that he was there, that he was safe, that he had chosen my space, my quiet, over his own. My longing was a constant, low-grade fever, but it was a fever I had learned to live with. This new proximity was both the cure and the poison. It soothed the ache of his absence while simultaneously making the desire for more, for something real, excruciatingly sharp. The couch was a boundary, a piece of furniture that maintained a respectable, platonic distance between us. It was a buffer zone. But one night, that boundary dissolved. He had been particularly wrecked that day. A massive project at his firm had gone sideways, and he had spent 16 hours in a state of high-alert panic. When he got to my place, he was practically vibrating with stress, his usual energy curdled into a raw, anxious hum. He couldn't settle. He paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, his mind still trapped in the server rooms and endless lines of code. The movie didn't work its usual magic. He couldn't focus. He just kept staring into the middle distance, his jaw tight. Eventually, he lay down on the sofa, curling into a tight ball, as if trying to make himself smaller, to contain the anxiety that was radiating off him in waves. After an hour of watching him wrestle with his invisible demons, I saw him shiver. It was a cold night, but the chills seemed to be coming from inside him. He looked small and vulnerable, stripped of all his usual confidence. My heart ached for him, a painful, physical clench in my chest. I didn't even think about it. I just reacted. I got the spare comforter from the linen closet, a thick, heavy thing, and draped it over him. He opened his eyes, looking up at me with a raw weariness that made my breath catch. "Thanks, Leo," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight. I turned to go back to my room, to retreat to my side of the invisible line. But his voice stopped me. "Hey," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Can you just stay for a minute?" My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a simple request, but it felt monumental. It was a deviation from the script we had been following for months. I hesitated for only a second before sitting down on the edge of the coffee table, facing him. We didn't talk. He just closed his eyes again, and his breathing seemed to deepen, to even out, just from my presence in the room. We stayed like that for a long time, the silence stretching and bending around us. I watched the subtle flicker of his eyelids, the way his hand, lying on his chest, rose and fell with each breath. The air felt charged, thick with unspoken things. It was no longer just about comfort. It was about a need so profound it had finally found a small, quiet voice. He needed me there. Not just my apartment, not just my couch. He needed me. And that realization was both a terrifying burden and the most beautiful gift I had ever been given. The inevitable escalation came a week later. It was born not of a crisis, but of a simple, quiet evening. There was no preceding 16-hour workday, no looming disaster. It was just a Friday. We had ordered pizza and were watching a terrible action movie, making fun of the dialogue. The mood was light, easy, the old, familiar rhythm of our friendship. But as the night wore on, the energy shifted. The jokes tapered off, and a soft, contemplative silence settled over us. He hadn't fallen asleep. Instead, he was just lying on the sofa, his head propped up on a cushion, watching the screen with an unreadable expression on his face. I was in my usual armchair, pretending to be engrossed in the film, but my awareness was entirely focused on him. I could feel his gaze shift from the television to me, and then back again. When the movie ended, he didn't move. He just stayed there, looking at the blank screen. I finally broke the silence. "Tired?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He shook his head slowly. "Not really," he said. He paused, and I could see him wrestling with a thought. "It's just my bed feels so big. And empty." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever said to me. It wasn't a complaint about work or stress. It was a confession of loneliness. A deep, cavernous loneliness that I understood all too well. I didn't know what to say. Every possible response felt either trite or far too honest. So I just waited, holding my breath, letting him own the space that his confession had created. He finally turned his head to look at me, his eyes searching my face in the dim light. "This is going to sound stupid," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "But would it be weird if I slept in your room tonight? On the floor, or whatever? I don't want to be alone." The request landed in the center of my chest like a physical blow, knocking all the air out of my lungs. The floor. He was offering to sleep on the floor in my room, like a child afraid of the dark seeking comfort from a parent. It was a gesture of such profound trust and such deep, unacknowledged need that it almost broke me. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and hope. This was a new threshold, a door I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. But looking at his face, at the undisguised plea in his eyes, I knew there was only one possible answer. "My bed is big enough for two," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You don't have to sleep on the floor." The silence that followed my offer was deafening. I felt as though I had just laid all my cards on the table, a handful of hearts in a game whose rules I didn't understand. I had just erased the final, most important boundary between us. I had invited him into my most private space, not as a guest, but as a companion in the dark. I watched his expression, trying to decipher the flicker of emotions that passed through his eyes: surprise, relief, and something else, something I couldn't name. He just nodded, a slow, single nod. "Okay," he whispered. And that one word, that simple agreement, felt like a tectonic shift, the ground beneath my feet rearranging itself into a new and terrifying landscape. Walking into my bedroom together felt surreal. This room, which had only ever been mine, which had held all my secret thoughts of him, was now a shared space. The air was thick with a strange, nervous energy. We moved around each other with a careful, almost choreographed awkwardness, like two dancers learning a new and complicated routine. He borrowed a t-shirt to sleep in, and when he emerged from the bathroom wearing it, my heart did a painful, stuttering flip. The shirt, which was old and soft and familiar on me, looked entirely different on him. It hung on his broader frame, a testament to how close he was, how real. We got into the bed from opposite sides, the mattress dipping under our respective weights. We lay on our backs, a careful, deliberate foot of space between us, staring up at the ceiling. The only light was a pale silver sliver from the moon, cutting across the foot of the bed. I was so acutely aware of him, it was almost painful. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gulf of sheets that separated us. I could hear the sound of his breathing, louder and more intimate in the close confines of my room than it had ever been from the living room. My entire body was a finely tuned instrument, registering every tiny shift in his weight, every rustle of the covers. I lay perfectly still, my muscles rigid, convinced that if I moved, I would betray the frantic, chaotic symphony of my own heartbeat. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance between us, to feel the solid warmth of his back against mine. The desire was a physical ache, a magnetic pull that I had to fight with every ounce of my self-control. This was a test, I told myself. A test of our friendship. He had come to me for comfort, for a remedy to his loneliness, not for this. Not for the desperate, unspoken love that was currently roaring in my ears like the sea. After what felt like an eternity of charged silence, he spoke. His voice was a low murmur in the dark. "Leo." I managed a response, my own voice tight. "Yeah." There was another long pause. I could feel him gathering his words. "Thanks," he said finally. "For not thinking I'm a complete headcase." The self-deprecation in his tone was a familiar shield, one he used whenever he felt too vulnerable. "You're not a headcase, Finn," I said, and the words were true. "You're just human." He let out a small, soft sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Then he shifted, rolling onto his side to face me. I didn't dare turn. I just kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my profile exposed to his gaze. I could feel him looking at me, and that feeling was more intimate than any touch. It was a feeling of being seen, truly seen, in the dark. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice even closer now. "Good night, Leo." "Good night, Finn," I whispered back to the ceiling. And eventually, against all odds, surrounded by the overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful presence of him, I fell asleep. That night established the final, most intimate, and most agonizing phase of our ritual. My bed became our shared space. Not every night, but often enough that it became a new kind of normal. The pretense of the couch was gone, replaced by this silent, mutual understanding. He would arrive, and after the movie, we would both just get up and walk to my bedroom. There were no more invitations, no more hesitant requests. It was an unspoken agreement. The first few times, we maintained that careful, chaste distance, two separate islands in the same sea of mattress. But as the nights wore on, the space between us began to shrink. It happened incrementally, a slow, unconscious drift. A foot might brush against another in the night. A hand, flung out in sleep, might land on a stretch of empty sheet that was no longer empty. One night, I woke in the pre-dawn hours to find him turned toward me, his face only inches from mine. One of his arms was thrown over my waist, his hand resting lightly on my hip. His breathing was warm and steady against my cheek. He was completely asleep, his expression peaceful. My heart stopped. I lay there, trapped in his unconscious embrace, every nerve in my body screaming. This was the thing I had dreamed of for years, and it was happening by accident. It meant nothing. It was just the random mechanics of sleep. But my body didn't know that. My body only knew the solid, comforting weight of his arm, the heat of his palm through my t-shirt, the impossible, devastating closeness of him. I didn't dare breathe. I just absorbed the feeling, memorizing it, knowing it was a stolen moment, a gift from his subconscious that his conscious mind would never have offered. After a few minutes that felt like a lifetime, I carefully, painstakingly, lifted his arm and shifted away, restoring the boundary he had unknowingly crossed. When he woke up later that morning, he would never know that for a few brief, breathtaking moments, he had held me. The tension of those nights was a living thing. It was a third presence in the room, a silent observer that sat in the space between our bodies. My mind was in a constant state of hypervigilance, analyzing every nuance, every gesture. When he would murmur in his sleep, I would try to decipher the words. When he shifted closer, my internal alarms would sound. I was living on a knife's edge of hope and terror. Every night was a gamble. Would this be the night the unspoken thing between us finally surfaced? Or would this be the night he realized what he was doing, what this looked like, and retreated back to his side of the bed, or worse, back to his own apartment for good? The ambiguity was killing me. He was giving me everything I had ever wanted, but without intention, without meaning. It was like being fed exquisite, delicious food that I knew was poisoned. Each taste was heaven, but I knew it was slowly destroying me. I became a student of his sleep, an expert in the geography of his unconsciousness. I learned the difference between the deep, motionless sleep of true exhaustion and the restless, twitching sleep of anxiety. I learned that he sometimes kicked in his dreams, echoes of his soccer-playing days. I learned that when he was truly relaxed, he made a soft, rumbling sound in his chest, just on the edge of a snore. These were secrets the daylight Finn would never have shared. They were vulnerabilities he only exposed in the dark, and I was the sole keeper of them. It was a profound intimacy, but it was also a profoundly lonely one. I was closer to him than anyone, and yet I had never felt more alone with my feelings. I was the curator of a museum that no one else would ever visit, the sole witness to the quiet, unguarded truth of him. The night everything changed started just like all the others. It was a Thursday, cold and clear. Finn had come over after a long day, and we were settled in my bed, the low murmur of some documentary playing on the laptop at the foot of the bed. We were lying on our sides, facing each other, a comfortable distance between us. The laptop cast a soft, white glow on our faces. He wasn't asleep. Neither of us was. We were just watching the film, but not really. The air between us felt different tonight. The usual tension was still there, but it was interwoven with something else, something softer. A kind of quiet anticipation. He broke the silence first. He just said my name. Leo, it wasn't a question. It was just a statement. My name, spoken into the quiet of the room. I met his gaze. In the pale light from the screen, his eyes were dark and serious. I could see the faint, rhythmic pulse in his neck. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I had the distinct feeling that we were standing at the edge of a cliff, and he had just taken the final step toward the precipice. Yeah, I managed to say, my voice a dry whisper. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw a universe of confusion and fear and a deep, aching vulnerability that mirrored my own. He was a man standing at a door he had never known was there, his hand hovering over the knob. The silence stretched, pulling taut between us. It was no longer comfortable. It was electric. It was the breathless moment before a lightning strike. Then, he whispered, so quietly I felt the words more than heard them. Would it be okay? He didn't specify what it was. He didn't have to. I knew. The question was not about one single action. It was about everything. It was about the couch, and the blanket, and the door left ajar. It was about the shrinking space between us and this bed. It was about the months of unspoken need, of ambiguous comfort. He was asking for permission to finally name the thing that had been living in the silence between us. He was asking if it was safe to cross the line. My own fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The sentry in my mind was screaming, sounding all the alarms, warning me of the risk, of the potential for ruin, ruining the friendship, ruining everything. But the rest of my heart, the part that had been starving for this for years, simply answered. Yes, I breathed. His eyes searched mine for another second, as if making sure. And then he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, a closing of the final few inches that separated us. There was no rush, no urgency. It was tentative, questioning. He brought his hand up and cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek just once. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that traveled through my entire body. And then he leaned in and kissed me. It was not a passionate kiss, not a kiss of pent-up desire finally unleashed. It was a kiss of profound gentleness, of quiet discovery. It was soft and hesitant, and it tasted of questions. His lips were asking, "Is this right? Is this real?" And with the slight pressure of my own, I was answering, "Yes. Yes, it is." The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it contained the entire history of our friendship, all the unspoken words, all the secret, silent yearning. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed together in the dark, the sound of it loud in the sudden, absolute stillness of the room. The boundary was gone. The river had changed its course, and we were on the other side, together. The morning after was a study in silence. I woke up first, just as the sun was beginning to cast a pale, gray light into the room. I was on my side, and Finn was still there, his back to me, his breathing deep and even. For a moment, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy washed over me. It was real. Last night was real. He was still here. But as the minutes ticked by and the light in the room grew stronger, a new feeling began to creep in, cold and sharp. Anxiety. He was too still. His back, which had been a source of comfort for a few brief hours, now felt like a wall. A barrier he had erected even in his sleep. I watched the slow rise and fall of his shoulders, and I felt a growing sense of dread. The beautiful, fragile thing we had created in the dark felt like it might not survive the harsh, revealing light of day. I must have drifted off again, because the next time I opened my eyes, the space beside me was empty. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow, the sheets were still warm from his body, but he was gone. A cold panic seized me. I sat up, listening. The apartment was silent. Too silent. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. Everything was neat. The Afghan folded on the armchair, the pizza box from last night gone. His shoes were gone from their place by the door. His jacket was no longer slung over the back of the chair. He had left. He had slipped out of my apartment while I was sleeping, without a word, without a note. He had vanished like a ghost, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his presence and the deafening silence of his absence. The fragile hope that had bloomed in my chest overnight withered and died, turning to ash. I had been a fool. I had misread everything. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been an ending. A moment of confusion or loneliness on his part, a mistake he was now running from as fast as he could. And I, in my desperate willingness, had let him ruin the one thing I couldn't bear to lose, our friendship. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The silence from him was absolute. I sent a tentative text the first afternoon. "Hey, you forgot your charger," a simple, low-stakes message that gave him an easy opening to reply. Nothing. The message sat there, delivered but unread, a small, gray monument to my humiliation. I tried calling the next day, but it went straight to voicemail. His voice, cheerful and familiar on his recorded greeting, was a cruel mockery. I left a message, trying to sound casual, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Hey, just checking in. Hope everything's okay." The silence that answered was his real reply. He was avoiding me. He was erasing me. The ritual was broken. The sanctuary had been desecrated, and it was my fault. I had said yes. I had allowed the hope to show, and it had terrified him. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting it, analyzing it until it lost all its magic and became nothing more than a clinical study in my own foolishness. The quiet of my apartment, which had once been a source of comfort, became a torment. Every corner of it held a memory of him. The sofa where he used to sleep, the kitchen counter where we'd lean and talk, the bed that now felt cavernously, mockingly empty. His absence was a physical presence, a ghost that sat in his chair and followed me from room to room. I couldn't work. I couldn't think. I felt hollowed out, a building with its foundation ripped away. The friendship had been the central pillar of my life for so long that I didn't know how to stand without it. The pain of the romantic rejection was sharp, but it was dwarfed by the agony of losing my best friend. I had been so careful for so long, the diligent guardian of our platonic bond, and in one moment of weakness, one whispered yes, I had burned the whole thing to the ground. After a week of this torturous silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew that if I didn't do something, the silence would harden into permanence, and what was broken between us would be irreparable. I had to face him. I had to know, even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine. So, on a cold, drizzly evening, almost exactly like the one that had started this whole descent, I found myself standing outside his apartment building. I felt sick with nerves. My hands were trembling as I buzzed his apartment. For a long second, there was no answer, and a part of me felt a cowardly sense of relief. But then the speaker crackled to life. "Hello." His voice was wary, tired. "Finn, it's me," I said, my own voice barely audible. "It's Leo. We need to talk." There was a long pause, so long I thought he was going to hang up. Then, the sound of the buzzer, sharp and loud, granting me entry. The walk up the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment felt like climbing a mountain. With every step, my heart pounded harder. What was I going to say? How could I possibly fix this? When I reached his door, it was already slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, except for the glow of a laptop screen in the living room. He was sitting on his couch, surrounded by takeout containers and empty coffee mugs. He looked even worse than he had on the nights he'd come to my place for refuge. He looked haunted. He didn't look up when I came in. He just kept staring at his screen, his shoulders hunched. I stood in the doorway, my jacket dripping onto his floor, the silence between us a thick, suffocating blanket. I was the one who finally spoke. Why? It was the only word I could manage. It was a small word for such a huge, gaping wound. He flinched, as if the word had physically struck him. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery so profound it stole my breath. "Leo, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what?" I asked, and now my own voice was shaking with a week's worth of pain and anger. "Sorry for the kiss? Or sorry for disappearing like a coward and leaving me to think I was crazy? Which one are you sorry for, Finn?" He winced and looked away, running a hand over his face. "Both," he said, his voice muffled. "All of it." He looked back at me, his expression raw and exposed. "I'm not sorry for the kiss, Leo. God, I'm not. That's the problem. I'm sorry because I'm a mess. I'm sorry because I freaked out." He finally stood up and took a hesitant step toward me. That night, it was the first time in months, maybe years, that I felt calm. He struggled for the words. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't just completely alone. And it wasn't the room or the bed. It was you. It's always been you. My anger began to dissolve, replaced by the familiar, aching pull of my feelings for him. "Then why did you run?" I whispered. "Because I'm scared," he said, the confession stark and honest in the dim light. "I looked at you the next morning, and you were sleeping, and I just panicked. This is not who I thought I was. I've spent my whole life on this one straight track, Leo. I had a plan, and you're not part of that plan. But then I kissed you, and it felt more real than anything in that stupid plan ever has. And it terrifies me. I don't know what this means. I don't know what I am." His confusion and fear were so palpable, so genuine, that my own hurt felt suddenly selfish. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was a man whose entire map of the world had been rendered useless overnight, and he was completely, terrifyingly lost. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a foot away from him. "So you thought the best solution was to cut me out completely?" I asked, my voice softer now. "To throw away years of friendship because you're scared?" He shook his head, a look of self-loathing on his face. "It was stupid. It was cruel. I was just trying to put things back in the box they came in. But they don't fit anymore." "Nothing fits." He finally met my eyes again, and I saw tears welling in his. "I miss you, Leo," he whispered. "This last week has been hell. The only thing worse than being confused is being confused without you, And there it was. The truth. Not a grand declaration of love, but something far more honest and more valuable. A confession of need. He needed me not just as a refuge, but as a partner in his confusion, as an anchor in his storm. The anger was gone completely now, washed away by a wave of profound empathy. I knew what it was like to be scared. I had been scared of my feelings for him for years. Now, we were both scared, together. I took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, a desperate, anchoring grip. "You don't have to know what you are, Finn," I said quietly. "You don't have to have a new plan today. We can just be. We can be confused together." A single tear tracked its way down his cheek. He nodded, unable to speak. He squeezed my hand, a silent communication that was louder than any words. In the quiet of his messy, lonely apartment, something new began to knit itself together between us. Not the old friendship, and not yet a new romance, but something in between. Something tentative and fragile and monumentally hopeful. The days that followed our confrontation were quiet and careful. We were navigating a new landscape without a map, learning the contours of this new version of us. The frantic anxiety of the previous week was replaced by a gentle, deliberate tenderness. We started over, not as friends, but as something undefined. We talked. For the first time, we really talked. He told me about the pressures he'd felt his whole life to be a certain kind of man, to follow a certain path. He talked about his relationship with Sarah, about the quiet, gnawing feeling that something essential was missing, a feeling he had always blamed on himself. I, in turn, told him about the years of quiet longing, about watching him from the sidelines, about the love I had kept hidden for fear of losing him. It was like lancing a wound, painful and messy, but utterly necessary for any real healing to begin. We didn't kiss again for a while. It felt important to rebuild our foundation with words first, with honesty. The physical intimacy had come before the emotional confession, and we needed to let the understanding catch up. But the non-physical intimacy grew exponentially. He started staying at my apartment again, but it was different now. There were no more pretenses. He stayed because he wanted to be with me. We would still lie in my bed at night, but now we would talk for hours in the dark, our voices low and soft. And when we finally fell asleep, the distance between us was gone. He would turn to me, or I to him, and our bodies would find each other in the dark, an arm slung over a waist, a head resting on a shoulder. It wasn't sexual. It was about comfort. It was about closing a circuit, about the profound, simple peace of not being alone. It was the physical manifestation of the emotional closeness we were finally allowing ourselves to have. The first time we held hands in public was a small, monumental event. We were walking through a park on a Sunday afternoon, coffees in hand. The conversation was easy, comfortable. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves were a riot of color. It was a perfectly ordinary moment. And then, as we walked, his hand brushed against mine. It wasn't an accident. He let it linger there for a second, a silent question. I answered by uncurling my fingers and lacing them with his. His grip was warm and firm. Neither of us said anything. We just kept walking, our hands clasped between us, a quiet, public declaration that meant more than any spoken words. I looked at our joined hands, at the way our fingers fit together, and I felt a sense of rightness, of peace, so profound it almost made me dizzy. The secret I had carried for so long was no longer a secret. It was a reality, warm and solid in my grasp. Our new normal was quiet, domestic, and deeply comforting. It was built of small, ordinary moments. It was me making coffee for 2 in the morning instead of 1. It was him leaving his toothbrush in my bathroom without asking. It was the easy, shared silence as we read on opposite ends of the sofa, his feet resting in my lap. The grand, terrifying passion I had once imagined was replaced by something far better, far more sustainable. It was a deep, abiding peace. It was the feeling of coming home. He was still the same Finn, driven, brilliant, and sometimes prone to bouts of intense anxiety about his work. And I was still the same Leo, quiet, observant, and more comfortable behind a camera than in front of it. But the dynamic between us had been fundamentally rewired. The yearning was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. The anxiety of the unspoken was gone, replaced by the comfort of the known. One evening, months later, we were lying in bed, in that familiar space that had been the stage for so much of our story. He was reading a book, and I was editing photos on my laptop. He reached out and traced the line of my jaw with his finger, a gesture that had become a familiar, beloved part of our new language. I turned to look at him. He was smiling, a soft, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "What?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking about that first night I slept here. In this bed." He paused, his expression turning more serious. "I was so lost, Leo. I felt like I was completely adrift. And I asked you if you'd think I was a head case for not wanting to be alone." I nodded, remembering the rawness of his voice in the dark. "And you said I was just human," he continued, his voice low. "I think that was the first time anyone had ever given me permission to be just that. Not the star player, not the genius coder. Just human. You've always seen that, haven't you?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the boy on the soccer field, the stressed-out student, the man who brought his exhaustion to my doorstep like an offering. "I've always just seen you," I said simply. And it was the truest thing I had ever said. His smile widened, and he leaned in and kissed me. It was not like the first kiss, the tentative, questioning thing it had been. This kiss was sure and deep and full of a quiet, shared history. It was a kiss that said, "I know who you are. I know who I am with you. And I am home." It was a kiss that held the promise of 1,000 more ordinary, beautiful moments to come. We build rooms inside ourselves to hold the things we are most afraid of. Rooms for our fears, our doubts, our secret loves. For years, my love for Finn lived in a room like that. A windowless, soundproof chamber where it could not be seen or heard, where it could not risk the beautiful, fragile architecture of our friendship. And I think he had a room like that, too. A place where he kept the parts of himself that didn't fit the blueprint he had drawn for his life. He didn't even know the room was there until his world started to shake, until the walls of his own expectations began to crack. What I never realized was that all the while I was guarding my own lonely secret, he was searching for a key. Not for my room, but for his own. He was looking for a way to let the light in. The incredible, terrifying, beautiful truth is that he found it in my quiet apartment, on my worn-out sofa, in the silent, steady presence of a friend who had been waiting all along. He didn't just cross a boundary that night, he kissed me. He unlocked a door. And in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, he finally invited me in, and we began to heal.